I was sitting in my home office when my former boss's number flashed across my phone screen. 15 days earlier, he had dismissed me without a second thought after 15 years of dedicated service. Now he was calling, his voice strained, because Westfield Industries, our $80 million client, had specifically asked for me by name and refused to work with anyone else. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just the loyal employee he had discarded. I was about to become his biggest competition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun like any other Tuesday at Hammond. Pierce Consulting. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., precisely an hour and a half before most of my colleagues would filter in. These early morning hours had become sacred to me over my 15-year tenure. Quiet moments to review strategy documents, analyze client data, and prepare for the day ahead without interruption. My office, while not the largest in the building, occupied a coveted corner position with views of both the river and the city skyline. The space reflected my methodical personality: organized bookshelves filled with industry references, walls adorned with framed project completion certificates, rather than personal photographs, and a desk arranged with meticulous precision. The only personal touch was a small crystal paperweight, a gift from my father when I graduated with my MBA 20 years ago. As Senior Strategy Director, I had built a reputation for solving the problems other directors deemed impossible. When clients had complex organizational challenges, unusual market positions, or particularly delicate transition issues, my name was the one whispered in planning meetings. Let's bring Catherine in on this one. I wasn't the most charismatic presence in client pitches, but I was the one they called when failure wasn't an option. At 9:15 a.m., my focus was interrupted by a calendar notification. Executive meeting, Boardroom A, mandatory attendance. The lack of agenda or preparation materials struck me as unusual, but I gathered my tablet and a notepad, straightened my charcoal gray suit jacket, and headed toward the executive floor. The atmosphere in the elevator seemed charged with an unusual tension. Bernard from marketing avoided eye contact, staring intently at his phone. Melissa from HR clutched her portfolio tighter than necessary, her knuckles white against the leather. Something significant was happening, and I appeared to be the only senior leader not privy to it. The boardroom was nearly full when I arrived, executives seated around the massive oak table with expressions ranging from uncomfortable to grimly resigned. CEO Victor Hammond sat at the head, his typical commanding presence somehow more pronounced. Beside him was Andrea Pierce, the company's co-founder, her face an unreadable mask. What caught my attention, however, was the unfamiliar man seated at Victor's right, mid-40s, expensively tailored suit, exuding the confident smile of someone who already knew the outcome of a game others hadn't realized had begun. Catherine, thank you for joining us, Victor said, gesturing to one of the few remaining seats. Now that we're all here, I have an important announcement regarding Hammond and Pierce's strategic direction. Victor stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. For the past 23 years, Andrea and I have built this firm with a singular focus on delivering exceptional strategic consulting services. Today, we take a significant step toward ensuring our continued growth and market relevance. He placed his hand on the shoulder of the unknown man beside him. I'm pleased to introduce Richard Morgan, who will be joining Hammond and Pierce as our new Chief Strategy Officer, effective immediately. The announcement hit me like a physical blow. Chief Strategy Officer, the position I had been working toward for the past 5 years, the role Victor himself had suggested I was being groomed for during my last performance review. Richard comes to us from Apex Consulting with an impressive track record of client acquisition and revenue growth. Victor continued. His dynamic leadership style and innovative approach to market positioning will help propel Hammond and Pierce into its next chapter. Richard stood, offering a practiced smile to the room. I'm thrilled to join such a prestigious firm. I've long admired Hammond and Pierce from afar, and I look forward to bringing fresh perspectives to your impressive client portfolio. I maintained my professional composure, years of boardroom negotiations having taught me the value of an unreadable expression. But internally, questions cascaded. Why hadn't I been informed? What had changed since my last review? Was there a performance issue I hadn't been made aware of? This strategic addition to our leadership team will necessitate some organizational restructuring, Victor continued, briefly glancing in my direction. Department heads will receive detailed information about these changes this afternoon. I expect everyone's full cooperation during this transition period. The meeting concluded quickly after that, executives dispersing with hushed conversations and sidelong glances. I remained seated, organizing my notes with deliberate calm until the room had nearly emptied. "Catherine, could you stay behind for a moment?" Victor asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't actually a request. Once the boardroom door closed, leaving just Victor, Andrea, and Richard, the pretense of normal corporate proceedings evaporated. "I'll be direct, Catherine," Victor began, no longer maintaining the warm tone he used in client meetings. "With Richard's arrival, your position as Senior Strategy Director is being eliminated." I kept my expression neutral, though I couldn't prevent a slight tightening of my grip on my pen. "I see. May I ask why I wasn't consulted about this organizational change given my senior position and 15-year tenure?" Andrea stepped in, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone delivering a prepared statement. "The decision was made at the board level based on our strategic assessment of market direction. Richard's profile is more aligned with where we need to position the firm." "And what exactly is that profile?" I asked, my voice remaining steady. Victor exchanged a glance with Richard before responding. "We need someone with greater market presence, Catherine. Someone who can be the face of Hammond and Pierce in industry publications, at conferences, someone with charisma that attracts major clients. You've done excellent work behind the scenes, but this role requires someone who commands attention." The subtext was unmistakable. At 52, my methodical approach and preference for substance over spectacle were being replaced by Richard's more dynamic, publicity-friendly style. "I understand," I said simply, because professionally I did. I had seen this pattern before at other firms. The gradual shift from substance to presentation, the prioritization of market perception over operational excellence. "We're prepared to offer you a transition package," Andrea added, sliding a folder across the table. 3 months severance, extended benefits, and a consultant agreement should we need your expertise on specific projects. I didn't reach for the folder immediately. "The Westfield Industries account, they're in the middle of their major reorganization. Who will be taking over?" "Richard will assume direct oversight of all strategic accounts," Victor replied. "We've arranged a transition meeting for tomorrow morning where you can brief him on ongoing projects." "And my team?" "Your direct reports will be redistributed under the new departmental structure," Andrea said. "Richard has experience managing larger teams and will make those determinations in the coming weeks." I nodded once, finally reaching for the severance folder. "When do you expect this transition to be completed?" "Your official last day will be Friday," Victor said. "HR will handle the details regarding office clearance and exit procedures. 3 days, 15 years, reduced to 3 days of handover and procedural formalities." "I'd like you to know," Victor added, his tone softening slightly, "that this decision wasn't made lightly. Your contributions to Hammond and Pierce have been significant. This is simply about the firm's future direction." I stood, smoothing my jacket with one hand while holding the severance folder with the other. "Thank you for the clarity. I'll prepare comprehensive transition documents for all my active accounts." As I turned to leave, Richard spoke for the first time since his introduction. "I've heard impressive things about your analytical capabilities, Catherine. Perhaps once the dust settles, we can discuss how your expertise might still benefit the firm in a consulting capacity. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable, a perfunctory acknowledgement of my skills while establishing his authority. I merely nodded in response, maintaining the professional demeanor that had become my trademark at Hammond and Pierce. Walking back to my office, I noticed how quickly news had traveled. Conversations hushed as I passed, expressions of colleagues shifting from curiosity to discomfort when they caught my eye. My assistant, Jessica, stood as I approached, her expression revealing that she had already heard. "Is it true?" she asked quietly as I reached my office door. "Yes, my position has been eliminated. The new chief strategy officer will be restructuring the department." I kept my voice neutral, aware of nearby ears. "Could you please clear my calendar for the next 3 days? I'll need to focus on preparing transition documents." Inside my office, I closed the door and finally allowed myself a moment of genuine reaction. Not anger or despair, but a curious sense of clarity. For 15 years, I had poured my expertise, my insights, and my dedication into building Hammond and Pierce's strategic consulting practice. I had solved impossible problems for countless clients, mentored dozens of junior consultants, and generated millions in revenue through methodical excellence rather than self-promotion. And yet, when the firm decided to prioritize perception over performance, I had become expendable. I turned to my computer and began the process that professional pride demanded: meticulous documentation of every active project, client relationship, notes, strategic assessment summaries, and transition recommendations. Whatever personal disappointment I felt would not compromise my professional standards. By late afternoon, Jessica knocked gently before entering with a cup of tea, a small tradition we had maintained over our 8 years working together. "Your team is asking questions," she said, placing the cup on my desk. "They've heard rumors, but nothing official." I considered this for a moment. "Please arrange a department meeting for 4:30 in Conference Room C. They deserve to hear it directly from me rather than through corridor whispers." At 4:30 precisely, I faced the 12 members of my strategic consulting team. Brilliant analysts, dedicated project managers, and emerging consultants I had personally recruited and mentored. Their expressions reflected the uncertainty that major organizational changes inevitably create. "By now, you've likely heard that significant changes are coming to Hammond and Pierce," I began, choosing directness over corporate euphemisms. "Richard, Morgan has joined as the new chief strategy officer, and as part of this restructuring, my position is being eliminated effective Friday." The reactions were immediate: whispered exclamations, exchanged glances, and from the senior members of the team, expressions that shifted quickly from shock to concern about their own positions. "You will each be receiving information about your reporting structure under the new organization," I continued. "I've been assured that there are no planned reductions to the strategy team itself, merely realignment under new leadership." Michael. Chen, our senior data analyst and my longest-serving team member, spoke up. "What about the Westfield account? We're at a critical juncture in their reorganization." "Richard will be assuming oversight of all strategic accounts," I replied. "I'll be conducting comprehensive handover briefings over the next 3 days." "This is absurd," said Rebecca Winters, one of our most talented strategy consultants. "The Westfield project was built entirely on your methodology. Their leadership specifically requested you lead the engagement." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "And they will receive excellent service from Hammond and Pierce under the new leadership structure," I responded, maintaining my professional tone. "Change is inevitable in consulting. Our responsibility is to ensure our clients experience seamless transitions." For the next 30 minutes, I addressed their questions with the candor and clarity I had always prioritized in our team culture. I didn't criticize the firm's decision, disparage Richard, or express personal disappointment. Instead, I focused on ensuring they understood what to expect in the coming weeks and how to protect their own positions during the transition. As the meeting concluded, I looked at these professionals I had guided and developed. Whatever structure emerges from this reorganization, remember what we've built together: an approach to strategic consulting based on substantive analysis and meaningful implementation, not just impressive presentations and theoretical frameworks. That foundation will serve each of you well, regardless of who sits in the director's chair. One by one, they approached to express personal thanks or share brief words of encouragement as they left. Jessica remained behind, her professional composure finally cracking. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice reflecting the genuine connection that had developed over our years working together. "I haven't decided yet," I replied honestly. "But before I consider next steps, I need to ensure proper transition of all client relationships." Back in my office, as evening shadows lengthened across the city skyline, I began preparing the detailed briefing documents for the Westfield Industries account. This particular client relationship had special significance, not just because it represented our largest revenue-generating account at $80 million annually, but because I had personally developed the comprehensive organizational transformation strategy they were now implementing. Kenneth Westfield, the third-generation CEO of the family-owned manufacturing conglomerate, had specifically sought out Hammond and Pierce based on my reputation for handling complex legacy business transformations. Over 3 years, I had built a relationship with their executive team founded on trust, deep industry knowledge, and the willingness to tell difficult truths when necessary. My phone chimed with a text message from Kenneth himself. "Hearing rumors of changes at H&P. Can you call when convenient?" I made a note to reach out to him tomorrow after the transition planning was further developed. Client relationships of this significance deserved careful handling during organizational changes. As I continued working well into the evening, meticulously, documenting every aspect of the strategic accounts I had managed, I found my thoughts repeatedly returning to a conversation with my father shortly before he passed away 5 years ago. He had built a successful management consulting practice of his own, later acquired by a larger firm that eventually sidelined him despite his founding role. "The mistake I made, Catherine," he had told me during one of our last discussions, "was believing that excellence alone was sufficient protection. I built something valuable, but failed to secure my position within it. Don't make the same error." At the time, I had interpreted his advice as encouragement to be more assertive about recognition and advancement at Hammond and Pierce. Now, I wondered if he had been suggesting something more fundamental about the relationship between creators and institutions. By midnight, my office was organized with military precision, labeled folders containing transition documents, client history summaries, and strategic recommendations for each account. Whatever personal feelings I had about the situation, professional integrity demanded nothing less than immaculate handover. As I finally prepared to leave, I paused at my office window, looking out at the illuminated city skyline. For 15 years, this view had been the backdrop to countless late nights, strategic breakthroughs, and quiet moments of satisfaction after successfully solving seemingly insurmountable client challenges. Tomorrow would bring the formal transition process, including my first meeting with Richard Morgan to brief him on the accounts he would be taking over. I would maintain the consummate professionalism that had defined my career, ensure my clients received proper care during the transition, and support my team through the organizational uncertainty. But as I switched off my office light for the penultimate time, I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had known with increasing clarity throughout the day. This transition represented not just an ending, but a potential beginning. One my father might have recognized as long overdue. The Wednesday morning that followed my dismissal dawned with unusual clarity. I had slept only 4 hours, yet awoke feeling strangely energized rather than exhausted. The uncertainty that typically accompanies major career disruptions was notably absent, Instead, I felt a curious sense of purpose forming beneath the professional obligations that remained. I arrived at Hammond and Pierce at my customary 7:30 a.m., nodding to the security guard who had greeted me at this hour for nearly a decade. My office appeared untouched since my late departure the previous evening. The transition documents arranged precisely as I had left them, my client files organized with meticulous care, the crystal paperweight catching the morning light as it had countless times before. The handover meeting with Richard Morgan was scheduled for 9 a.m., giving me 90 minutes to finalize my preparations and respond to several urgent client emails that had arrived overnight. I worked with focused efficiency, addressing each matter with the thorough attention I would have given had my position not been eliminated. Professional responsibility didn't diminish with organizational status. At precisely 8:58 a.m., Jessica appeared at my door. "Mr. Morgan is here for your meeting," she announced, her tone carefully neutral, though her expression conveyed unspoken support. Richard entered with the confident stride of someone who believed in his own narrative. "Catherine," he said, extending his hand with practiced cordiality. "I appreciate your professionalism during this transition." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "I've prepared comprehensive briefings on all strategic accounts, with particular detail on those currently in active implementation phases." For the next 2 hours, I methodically walked him through each major client relationship, the historical context, current strategic initiatives, key stakeholders, potential challenges, and critical success factors. Richard took notes on a premium leather-bound notebook, occasionally interjecting with questions that revealed both his intelligence and his fundamentally different approach to strategic consulting. These implementation frameworks are remarkably detailed, he observed while reviewing the Westfield Industries documentation. But I notice there's minimal emphasis on visibility milestones or publicity opportunities. Kenneth Westfield specifically requested a substance-first approach, I explained. Their organization values measured implementation over market perception. The communication strategy is intentionally conservative until operational transformation demonstrates measurable success. Richard made a note, his expression suggesting skepticism. "That approach has its place, but in my experience, early visibility creates accountability and momentum. I may recommend adjustments to their communication strategy." I nodded without comment, recognizing the philosophical divide between us. Richard viewed strategic consulting through the lens of perception management and market positioning. I had always prioritized operational substance and measurable outcomes. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but they reflected fundamentally different consultative philosophies. As the briefing continued, I noticed Richard paying particular attention whenever I mentioned Kenneth Westfield or the broader Westfield Industries engagement. His questions became more frequent, his note-taking more detailed. The $80 million account clearly represented a significant prize in his new portfolio. "You've developed quite a relationship with Westfield," he noted as we concluded the briefing. "Their CEO texted you directly about the transition?" "Kenneth values transparent communication," I replied. "We've established a working relationship based on direct access and unfiltered feedback. It's been effective for navigating their complex transformation." Richard closed his notebook, studying me with newfound interest. "Would you be willing to join me for the initial client meeting? Having you there would help establish continuity." The request wasn't surprising. Client transitions of this magnitude typically benefited from ceremonial handovers, where departing consultants formally introduced their successors. It represented standard professional practice rather than special consideration. "Of course," I agreed. "I've already drafted a transition communication for all major clients. I'll forward it to you for review before distribution." As Richard left with the extensive briefing materials I had prepared, Jessica entered with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. "How did it go?" she asked, placing the cup on my desk. As expected, I replied. He's intelligent, confident, and has a clear vision for how he wants to position the firm. His approach differs significantly from mine, but that's precisely why Victor hired him. Jessica hesitated before speaking again. The team is organizing a farewell gathering for Friday evening at Riverview Restaurant. Nothing elaborate, just a chance to properly acknowledge your contributions. The gesture touched me unexpectedly. Corporate departures often ended with awkward handshakes and hollow promises to stay in touch. A formal gathering organized by my team reflected something more meaningful than obligatory professional courtesy. Please thank them for the thoughtfulness, I said. I'd be honored to attend. The remainder of the morning was devoted to finalizing transition documentation for my remaining accounts. At 12:30 p.m., my phone rang with Kenneth Westfield's direct number displayed on the screen. I had planned to call him later that afternoon after receiving approval on the transition communication, but it appeared he had grown impatient waiting for a response to his text message. Kenneth, I answered, maintaining my typical professional tone. I was planning to call you this afternoon. Too late, he replied, his characteristic directness immediately apparent. Had lunch with Terrence from Rivington Partners yesterday. He mentioned Hammond and Pierce had recruited Richard Morgan from Apex. Given our history with Apex's approach, I connected the dots and figured changes might be coming to our account team. Kenneth's insight wasn't surprising. As CEO of a $3 billion manufacturing conglomerate, he maintained extensive industry relationships and received information through channels invisible to most. You're correct, I confirmed. Hammond and Pierce is implementing organizational changes. Richard Morgan has joined as Chief Strategy Officer, and my position has been eliminated effective Friday. The line went silent for a moment before Kenneth responded. That's remarkably short-sighted of Hammond and Pierce. You've been instrumental in developing our transformation strategy. Richard is highly qualified, I said, maintaining professional neutrality. He'll be reaching out soon to introduce himself and ensure a smooth transition for Westfield Industries. I'm sure he's perfectly competent, Kenneth replied, his tone suggesting limited interest in Richard's qualifications. But our board approved this engagement based specifically on your methodological approach and industry expertise. The last thing we need is another consultant who prioritizes splashy presentations over substantive implementation. His assessment of Richard seemed unfair given they had never met, but I recognized it stemmed from previous negative experiences with similar consulting approaches. Richard brings valuable perspective that may benefit certain aspects of your transformation, I offered diplomatically. Catherine, Kenneth said, his voice taking on the direct tone he used when bypassing conversational niceties. Would you be available for dinner tonight? Marion and I would appreciate the chance to thank you personally for your contributions to Westfield's transformation. The invitation was unexpected. While I had developed a strong professional relationship with Kenneth over 3 years of consulting engagement, our interactions had remained firmly within business contexts. Dinner with him and his wife represented a crossing of professional boundaries I had carefully maintained throughout my career. That's very kind, I responded, but unnecessary. Professional transitions are standard in consulting relationships. This isn't about professional courtesy, Kenneth insisted. It's about having a candid conversation regarding Westfield's future strategic direction. 7 o'clock at the Grant Room. Nothing formal, just honest discussion. After a moment's consideration, I accepted the invitation. Whatever personal reservations I might have about blurring professional boundaries, I owed Kenneth the courtesy of a proper transition conversation, given the significance of the Westfield engagement to both our organizations. The afternoon proceeded, with methodical efficiency, as I continued preparing transition documentation and responding to client inquiries. At 3:30 p.m., Jessica informed me that Victor Hammond had requested a brief meeting. I found the CEO in his corner office, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city with a tumbler of something amber in his hand. Unusual for mid-afternoon on a Wednesday. "Catherine," he said as I entered, turning from the view. "Thank you for coming up. Please have a seat." I settled into one of the leather chairs positioned across from his desk, noting the unusual tension in his typically composed demeanor. "I wanted to personally acknowledge your contributions to Hammond and Pierce," he began, taking his own seat. 15 years of exceptional service deserves more than just procedural formalities." "I appreciate the sentiment," I replied, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Yesterday's dismissal had been direct and definitive, with little room for reconsideration. Victor sipped his drink before continuing. "Richard reviewed your transition documentation this morning. He was quite impressed with the depth of client knowledge you've developed, particularly with Westfield Industries. Thorough knowledge transfer is simply professional responsibility," I stated, maintaining neutral courtesy. "Indeed," Victor nodded, studying me carefully. "Richard mentioned you've agreed to join him for the initial Westfield meeting. That's commendable, given the circumstances." The slight hesitation in his voice suggested there was more to this conversation than perfunctory acknowledgement of my professionalism. "Is there something specific about the Westfield transition that concerns you, Victor?" He placed his glass on the desk, his expression shifting to one I recognized from difficult client negotiations. "To be candid, Catherine, we're concerned about retention risk with Westfield. Kenneth can be particular about his advisory relationships." The unstated question hung in the air between us. Would I use my relationship with Kenneth Westfield to undermine Hammond and Pierce's retention of their largest client? The mere fact that Victor felt compelled to have this conversation revealed far more about their concerns than his carefully chosen words. "I've already drafted the client transition communication," I replied evenly. "It emphasizes Hammond and Pierce's continued commitment to Westfield's strategic objectives and introduces Richard as a valuable addition to their service team. You'll have it for review within the hour." Relief visibly softened Victor's expression. "That's precisely what I would have expected from you. Your professionalism has always been exemplary." As I left Victor's office and returned to my own, I reflected on the curious inversion that had occurred in just 24 hours. Yesterday, my methodical approach and relationship-building skills had been deemed insufficient for Hammond and Pierce's future direction. Today, those same qualities represented critical assets they feared losing access to. At 5:30 p.m., I left the office to prepare for dinner with Kenneth and Marion Westfield. My apartment, like my office, reflected my preference for thoughtful organization and functional elegance. Open concept with minimalist furniture, walls featuring abstract art and muted tones, and bookshelves organized by subject rather than author or title. It was a space designed for clarity and purposeful reflection. After changing into a simple but elegant black dress appropriate for the Grant Room's formal atmosphere, I spent several minutes considering the ethical boundaries of my upcoming conversation with Kenneth. Professional integrity demanded that I support Hammond and Pierce's continued relationship with Westfield Industries, regardless of my personal circumstances. Yet I also owed Kenneth the candid assessment he was clearly seeking regarding the potential impact of leadership changes on his company's strategic implementation. The Grant Room occupied the entire top floor of the historic Merchants Building downtown, offering panoramic views of the city through walls of glass that had replaced the original 1920s architecture. Kenneth and Marion were already seated when I arrived at a corner table that balanced privacy with the dramatic cityscape backdrop. "Catherine," Kenneth rose to greet me, extending his hand. At 64, he carried himself with the unpretentious confidence of someone who had built substantial value without becoming enamored with his own success. Beside him, Marion offered a warm smile that softened her otherwise reserved demeanor. "Thank you for the invitation. I said as I took my seat. Though I must admit, it feels unusual to be discussing professional matters in this context. Then let's dispense with formalities, Kenneth replied, characteristically direct. Hammond and Pierce has made a significant strategic error in your dismissal, one that potentially jeopardizes our working relationship with the firm. The bluntness of his assessment was startling, even given his typically straightforward communication style. I appreciate your confidence in my work, I responded carefully. But Richard Morgan brings considerable expertise that will benefit Westfield's transformation efforts. We've encountered Richard's approach before, Marian interjected, her first contribution to the conversation carrying the incisiveness that had made her a formidable CFO before her retirement. 3 years ago, Apex Consulting proposed a visibility-first strategy for our East Asian expansion. The resulting implementation was superficially impressive, but operationally hollow. Richard is working within Hammond and Pierce's methodological framework now, I pointed out, maintaining professional neutrality. The firm's approach differs significantly from Apex's. Kenneth leaned forward slightly. The firm's approach was your approach, Catherine. That's precisely why we selected Hammond and Pierce after our experience with Apex. We needed a strategist who prioritized substance over spectacle, who would tell us uncomfortable truths rather than what we wanted to hear. His assessment was accurate but placed me in an ethically complex position. Professional integrity demanded that I support Hammond and Pierce's continued relationship with Westfield Industries, yet Kenneth's concerns reflected legitimate considerations about strategic alignment. Every consultant brings unique perspective, I offered diplomatically. While Richard's approach may differ from mine, he'll have access to all the foundational work we've established together. That's not why we asked you to dinner, Marian said, her direct gaze making it clear the conversation was about to shift direction. We want to discuss your plans moving forward. I haven't finalized my next steps, I admitted. My immediate focus has been ensuring proper transition of client relationships. Kenneth exchanged a glance with Marian before continuing. For 3 years, we've benefited from your strategic guidance while Hammond and Pierce benefited from your contribution to their revenue. That arrangement made sense when you had the firm's resources behind you. Now that they've demonstrated such poor judgment, perhaps it's time to consider a more direct relationship. The implication was unmistakable. They were suggesting I continue advising Westfield Industries independently rather than through Hammond and Pierce. The proposition created immediate ethical concerns about client solicitation and non-compete, obligations that typically governed consulting relationships. I appreciate your confidence, I replied carefully. But my separation agreement includes standard provisions regarding client relationships. Any continuation of our professional engagement would need to occur through proper channels and with appropriate consideration of existing agreements. Of course, Kenneth nodded. We respect professional boundaries, but those boundaries have specific limitations and durations. Once those expire, we would be very interested in discussing continued strategic advisory services. Before I could formulate an appropriate response, Kenneth continued. In the meantime, Marian and I have been discussing the composition of Westfield's board of directors. We've been seeking someone with comprehensive strategic perspective and manufacturing industry expertise. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn that required careful navigation. Board composition is a critical governance consideration, I acknowledged neutrally. The right strategic perspective can be tremendously valuable during major transformations. Precisely, Marian agreed. Which is why we'd like to nominate you for one of our independent director positions at next month's shareholder meeting. The proposal was surprising not just in its timing, but in its implications. Board directorship represented a fundamentally different relationship than consulting, one that would place me in a governance role rather than an advisory capacity, with different ethical considerations and professional boundaries. That's a significant proposition that would require careful consideration, I responded, genuinely taken aback by the unexpected offer. Take whatever time you need, Kenneth said. But understand that from Westfield's perspective, your strategic insight has always been the primary value, not the Hammond and Pierce brand behind it. As dinner continued, our conversation shifted to broader industry trends and personal interests, creating space for me to process the unexpected propositions they had presented. By the time we concluded the evening, I had neither accepted nor declined their offers, maintaining professional openness while ensuring appropriate boundaries. The drive home through nighttime city streets afforded quiet reflection on the remarkable shift that had occurred in just 36 hours. On Tuesday morning, I had been a senior director at a prestigious consulting firm, believing my professional value was inextricably linked to that institutional affiliation. By Wednesday evening, I was contemplating possibilities that existed, entirely independent of organizational structure. Possibilities that recognize the intrinsic value of expertise I had cultivated over decades. As I entered my apartment and switched on the lights, my phone chimed with an email notification. The message was from my former University of Pennsylvania faculty advisor, Professor Eleanor Mitchell, responding to a lunch invitation I had extended weeks ago. Catherine, I'd be delighted to meet. Recent developments at the Wharton Executive Education Program align remarkably with your expertise. Let's discuss over lunch. Perhaps there's mutual opportunity worth exploring. Does Friday work? Eleanor. The timing seemed almost orchestrated, though I knew it was merely coincidence. Yet it represented another unexpected avenue opening precisely as institutional doors were closing. I moved to my home office, opened my laptop, and began creating a structured document to evaluate these emerging possibilities. Professional reinvention required the same methodical analysis I had always applied to client challenges: careful assessment of options, identification of constraints, evaluation of potential outcomes, and strategic sequencing of decisions. As midnight approached, I had constructed a comprehensive framework for navigating the transition period ahead. Unlike the uncertainty that typically accompanies career disruption, I felt a growing sense of purposeful clarity. The professional identity I had built over 15 years wasn't disappearing with my Hammond and Pierce title. It was simply emerging from institutional constraints I had long ago outgrown. I closed my laptop and moved to the apartment windows, overlooking the city lights. For 15 years, I had channeled my expertise through organizational structures that ultimately failed to recognize its full value. Now, for the first time, I was contemplating what that expertise might accomplish when applied directly, without institutional filtering or attribution to others. Tomorrow would bring the continued formalities of professional transition at Hammond and Pierce. I would maintain the impeccable standards and ethical boundaries that had always defined my work. But beneath that visible process, something more significant was taking shape: a recognition that what Hammond and Pierce had dismissed as insufficient might actually represent my greatest professional strength. Thursday morning at Hammond and Pierce carried the strange liminality of professional transitions. I remained physically present in my office, performing the necessary functions of knowledge transfer and client communication, while emotionally beginning to detach from the organization that had been my professional home for 15 years. The handover process continued with mechanical efficiency. Richard Morgan and I conducted a conference call with the Westfield Industries implementation team, during which I formally introduced him as the new strategic lead. I maintained impeccable professionalism throughout, emphasizing Richard's expertise and Hammond and Pierce's unwavering commitment to Westfield's transformation objectives. What I couldn't mention, given professional ethics, was Kenneth Westfield's dinner invitation or his proposed board directorship. Those conversations existed in a parallel professional universe that would only converge with my Hammond and Pierce responsibilities once proper boundaries and timing had been established. At 11:30 a.m., Jessica appeared at my office door. "Richard would like to see you in his office when you have a moment," she reported. her expression suggesting she found the request as presumptuous as I did. Richard had occupied his new office for barely 24 hours, yet was already establishing territorial authority through location-based summons. "Please let him know I'll stop by at noon," I replied, maintaining the small dignities of professional autonomy even in transition. At precisely noon, I arrived at what had formerly been Marcus Whitfield's office, our previous chief strategy officer who had retired 6 months earlier, creating the vacancy Richard now filled. The space had already been transformed, with Marcus's traditional furnishings replaced by sleek modern pieces that reflected contemporary corporate aesthetics. "Catherine, come in," Richard greeted me with practiced cordiality. "Thank you for making time. I wanted to discuss the Westfield account in more detail." I settled into one of the visitor chairs, noting it was considerably less comfortable than the ergonomic models I had selected for my own office. "Of course. Was there something specific beyond what we covered in yesterday's briefing?" Richard leaned forward slightly, adopting the intense expression of someone about to share significant insight. "I reviewed the complete Westfield file last night, including the initial engagement proposal from 3 years ago. Your strategic framework is remarkably comprehensive." "The Westfield transformation required holistic approach," I acknowledged. "Their manufacturing legacy, family governance structure, and market position created unique challenges that demanded integrated strategy rather than modular solutions." "Precisely," Richard nodded, his expression suggesting newfound appreciation. "Which is why I'd like to propose an arrangement that might benefit all parties involved." I maintained neutral professionalism while internally noting the shift in his demeanor from yesterday's confident ownership to today's collegial outreach. "I'm listening." "Hammond and Pierce would like to retain you as executive consultant on the Westfield account for a 6-month transition period," he explained. "You would maintain client relationship continuity while I develop deeper understanding of their organizational context. We'd structure it as an independent consulting arrangement rather than employment relationship." The proposal was surprising, not in its content, but in its timing, just 48 hours after my position had been eliminated. Clearly, something had transpired since our handover meeting yesterday to prompt this sudden reevaluation of my value to the firm. "That's an unexpected proposition given Tuesday's organizational decision," I observed, neither accepting nor rejecting the offer. Richard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. After reviewing the Westfield materials more thoroughly and speaking with their implementation team this morning, it's evident that your specific expertise would benefit a measured transition. What remained unstated was the likely reality. Someone from Westfield, perhaps Kenneth himself, had expressed concerns about my departure, prompting Hammond and Pierce to reconsider the abruptness of their transition plan. "I appreciate the offer," I replied carefully. "I assume Victor and Andrea are aware of this proposed arrangement?" "It was their suggestion," Richard confirmed, inadvertently revealing that the direction had come from the highest levels of the firm. "They recognize the importance of maintaining relationship continuity with an account of Westfield's significance. The situation presented a complex ethical and strategic calculation. The proposed consulting arrangement would certainly provide financial stability during my professional transition while allowing me to fulfill my obligation to Westfield's implementation team. However, it would also constrain my ability to pursue other opportunities, including Kenneth's board directorship proposition, which represented a more significant long-term relationship. I'll need to review the specific terms before making any decision," I said, maintaining professional neutrality. "Could you have the formal proposal sent to my personal email by end of day? I'd like to consider it over the weekend." Richard seemed relieved by my response, which neither committed to nor rejected the proposition. "Absolutely. I'll have legal prepare the documentation immediately. And Catherine," he added as I stood to leave, "I want you to know that this isn't merely a stopgap measure. Your expertise is genuinely valuable to Hammond and Pierce." I offered a non-committal smile in response. It's always good when professional value is recognized, regardless of timing. Returning to my office, I found Jessica waiting with a cup of tea and an expression of barely contained curiosity. "Richard looked unusually concerned when he requested that meeting," she observed, placing the tea on my desk. "Something significant." "They're offering a 6-month consulting arrangement for the Westfield account," I explained, knowing Jessica's discretion was absolutely reliable after 8 years of working together. Apparently, my expertise has newfound value. Jessica's expression shifted from curiosity to knowing satisfaction. Kenneth Westfield made his dissatisfaction known, didn't he? "That would be a reasonable inference," I acknowledged, though Richard framed it as their strategic decision after reviewing the account documentation. "Of course he did," Jessica replied with uncharacteristic directness. "Heaven forbid they acknowledge misjudging your importance to client relationships." Her loyalty was touching, though I maintained more measured perspective. Organizational decisions reflect institutional priorities rather than individual assessments. Hammond & Pierce is simply protecting an important client relationship through appropriate transition management. Jessica seemed unconvinced by my diplomatic interpretation, but returned to professional matters. "Your lunch with Professor Mitchell is confirmed for tomorrow at 1 p.m. at Meridian Restaurant. I've adjusted your transition schedule to accommodate it." "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciative of her continued attentiveness despite my imminent departure. "Could you also schedule 30 minutes with Victor this afternoon? I should discuss this consulting proposal with him directly." At 3 p.m. I found myself once again in Victor Hammond's corner office, though his demeanor had shifted considerably from yesterday's tension to today's careful cordiality. "Catherine," he greeted me warmly, gesturing to the seating area rather than the more formal arrangement across his desk. "Thank you for making time. I understand Richard discussed our consulting proposal with you." "He did," I confirmed, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs. "It's certainly an interesting proposition, given Tuesday's organizational decision." Victor had the grace to acknowledge the contradiction. "I realize the timing may seem inconsistent. After Richard's deeper review of the Westfield relationship, we recognize that a more gradual transition would benefit all parties, particularly after Kenneth Westfield expressed concerns about continuity," I suggested, deciding directness might be more productive than diplomatic pretense. Victor's expression confirmed my assessment before he verbalized it. "Kenneth called this morning. He was quite direct about his expectations regarding implementation leadership. Your dinner meeting apparently left him with concerns about our commitment to his strategic priorities." The situation was becoming clearer. Kenneth had leveraged his position as Hammond & Pierce's largest client to express displeasure about my dismissal, prompting this hasty attempt at relationship preservation. "The proposed consulting arrangement may address immediate concerns," I acknowledged, "but it doesn't resolve the fundamental strategic misalignment Kenneth perceives between Westfield's implementation needs and Richard's approach. Which is precisely why we need your involvement during this transition period," Victor countered. "You can help Richard understand Westfield's unique requirements while ensuring implementation continuity." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Victor outlining generous financial terms for the proposed consulting arrangement while emphasizing Hammond & Pierce's genuine recognition of my expertise. Throughout, I maintained professional courtesy while committing only to reviewing the formal proposal rather than accepting the arrangement outright. As our meeting concluded, Victor escorted me to his office door, a courtesy he typically reserved for important clients rather than internal colleagues. "I hope you'll consider our offer seriously, Catherine. Despite the circumstances of this week's reorganization, your contributions to Hammond & Pierce have been genuinely valuable." "I appreciate the acknowledgement," I replied diplomatically. "I'll review the proposal when it arrives and respond early next week." Walking back to My office, I reflected on the remarkable shift in institutional assessment that had occurred in just 48 hours. On Tuesday, my methodical approach and relationship-building skills had been deemed insufficient for Hammond and Pierce's strategic direction. By Thursday, those same qualities had become valuable assets worth significant compensation to retain. The reversal wasn't about me personally, of course. It reflected the economic reality of client relationship management. Hammond and Pierce stood to lose an $80 million account if Kenneth Westfield decided my departure represented unacceptable implementation risk. The consulting offer was simple business mathematics, rather than genuine reevaluation of my professional value. The remainder of the afternoon was devoted to finalizing transition documentation and conducting handover meetings with my team members. Throughout, I maintained the same careful professionalism that had characterized my entire Hammond and Pierce tenure, focusing on appropriate knowledge transfer rather than personal circumstances. At 5:30 p.m., as I was preparing to leave for the day, my phone chimed with an email notification. The message was from Franklin Webb, managing partner at Highbridge Capital Partners, one of the premier private equity firms specializing in manufacturing sector investments. Catherine Kenneth Westfield suggested I reach out regarding potential advisory opportunities with several of our portfolio companies. Your manufacturing transformation expertise aligns with challenges we're addressing across multiple investments. Would you be available for breakfast next Wednesday to discuss? Franklin. The timing was remarkable, further evidence that Kenneth had been busy making introductions on my behalf following our dinner conversation. The Highbridge opportunity represented precisely the type of independent advisory work that could form the foundation of a consulting practice outside institutional constraints. As I gathered my belongings to leave for the day, Jessica appeared, with a sealed envelope. "This just arrived from legal," she said, handing me the document. "I assume it's the consulting proposal." "Thank you," I replied, placing the envelope in my briefcase without opening it. "And thank you for everything this week, Jessica. Your support has been invaluable during this transition." Her professional composure softened momentarily. "It's been my privilege to work with you, Catherine. Whatever you decide about their consulting offer, I hope you'll keep in touch." "Absolutely," I assured her, genuinely meaning it. Professional relationships of Jessica's quality were too valuable to lose through organizational transitions. The drive home through evening traffic provided space for reflection on the remarkable sequence of events that had unfolded since Tuesday's dismissal meeting. In just 72 hours, what had initially appeared to be professional setback was revealing itself as potential catalyst for something more significant. A recalibration of how my expertise might be applied beyond institutional boundaries. At home, I changed into more casual attire before settling at my dining room table with the Hammond and Pierce consulting proposal, Kenneth's board directorship offer, the Wharton executive education possibility Professor Mitchell had hinted at, and now Franklin Webb's advisory opportunity. Arranged before me, these options represented not fragmented alternatives, but potential components of an integrated professional identity, one defined by expertise rather than organizational affiliation. I opened my laptop and began creating a structured analysis of these emerging possibilities, evaluating each against multiple criteria: alignment with professional strengths, developmental opportunity, economic value, implementation timeline, and potential conflicts. The methodical approach mirrored how I would assess strategic options for clients, applying analytical rigor to complex decisions with multiple variables. By 9 p.m., a coherent framework had emerged, not a traditional career plan with linear progression through hierarchical positions, but an integrated portfolio approach to professional contribution. The Hammond and Pierce consulting arrangement could provide immediate stability while establishing the precedent of independent advisory relationship. The Westfield board directorship would offer governance experience and strategic oversight rather than implementation responsibility. The Highbridge advisory role could diversify industry application of manufacturing transformation expertise. and the Wharton connection might provide intellectual community and knowledge dissemination beyond commercial application. Together, these components suggested a professional identity unconstrained by institutional boundaries, one that applied deep expertise across multiple contexts while maintaining substantive focus rather than diluting specialization. At 9:30 p.m., my contemplation was interrupted by an unexpected text message from Richard Morgan. "Catherine, we need to discuss the Westfield situation urgently. Kenneth called Victor again this afternoon. Can we meet tomorrow morning before the transition meetings? This is becoming complicated." The message's tone suggested escalating concern rather than professional courtesy. Clearly, Kenneth had continued expressing dissatisfaction about my departure, creating increasing pressure on Hammond and Pierce leadership. I replied with deliberate neutrality. "I can meet at 8:30 a.m. in my office. However, I haven't had sufficient time to review the consulting proposal yet." Richard's response came immediately. "That's fine. This is about new developments. See you at 8:30. The exchange suggested that Hammond and Pierce's carefully constructed transition plan was encountering significant resistance from Westfield. Resistance that apparently went beyond what could be resolved through the consulting arrangement they had proposed this morning. At precisely 8:30 a.m. Friday morning, my final official day at Hammond and Pierce, Richard arrived at my office looking considerably less composed than in our previous interactions. His typically immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain. A slightly loosened tie, faint shadows beneath his eyes suggesting insufficient sleep. "Thank you for meeting before hours," he began, closing my office door. "We have a situation developing with Westfield that requires immediate attention." "What's happened?" I asked, maintaining professional focus despite my growing curiosity about the evident urgency. Richard ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, a nervous gesture that seemed out of character for his typically controlled demeanor. "Kenneth? Westfield called Victor again late yesterday afternoon. He's requesting an emergency meeting with Hammond and Pierce leadership this morning at 11 a.m. "That's certainly unusual timing," I observed neutrally. "Did he indicate the purpose?" "Not specifically," Richard replied, his discomfort evident. "But he insisted that you be present for the discussion, which suggests it relates to the transition of your responsibilities." The situation was becoming clearer. Kenneth was leveraging Westfield's position as Hammond and Pierce's largest client to influence organizational decisions that would typically remain internal matters. His insistence on my presence at this meeting indicated he was pursuing some agenda beyond normal client relationship management. "I assume Victor agreed to the meeting?" I asked, though the answer was obvious given Richard's presence in my office. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "It's scheduled for 11 a.m. in the main boardroom. Victor, Andrea, myself, and you, Kenneth specifically, requested a private meeting without the implementation team present." The arrangement suggested a high-level strategic discussion rather than operational implementation concerns, further evidence that Kenneth was involving himself in Hammond and Pierce's organizational decisions in unusual ways. "I'll attend, of course," I assured Richard. "Though as of 5 p.m. today, I'll no longer be officially affiliated with Hammond and Pierce unless the consulting arrangement is finalized." "About that," Richard said, his expression suggesting further complications. "Victor would like to discuss amendments to the consulting proposal before the Westfield meeting. He's asked if you could meet him at 10 a.m. in his office." The sequence was becoming almost comical in its transparent desperation. Hammond and Pierce leadership scrambling to retain control of a major client relationship that was slipping from their grasp due to their own organizational decisions. "I can meet Victor at 10 a.m., I agreed, maintaining professional courtesy despite the increasingly apparent leverage shift occurring. Though I should note that I've received several other professional opportunities that may impact my availability for consulting arrangements." Richard's expression tightened slightly at this revelation. "May I ask the nature of these opportunities?" They're preliminary discussions at this point, I replied diplomatically, but they include potential board directorship and private equity advisory roles. The information clearly concerned him, though he attempted to maintain professional composure. I see. Well, I'm sure we can structure our consulting arrangement to accommodate other commitments. Your expertise is valuable enough to warrant flexibility. As Richard left to prepare for his day, I reflected on the remarkable inversion that had occurred since Tuesday's dismissal meeting. In just 4 days, I had transitioned from disposable organizational component to essential relationship asset. Not through any change in my professional capabilities, but through external validation of expertise Hammond and Pierce had failed to properly value. At 10 a.m., I arrived at Victor's office for our scheduled meeting. His expression suggested the strain of managing an increasingly complex situation not of his choosing. "Catherine," he greeted me, gesturing to the seating area rather than his desk, a subtle indication that this conversation would be negotiation between equals rather than organizational directive. "Thank you for accommodating these urgent developments." "Of course," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "Richard mentioned Kenneth has requested an emergency meeting." Victor nodded, his usual confident demeanor noticeably subdued. "Kenneth called again yesterday afternoon. He was quite direct about his concerns regarding your departure from Hammond and Pierce. Client continuity during transitions is always a delicate matter," I observed neutrally. "This goes beyond typical transition concerns," Victor admitted. "Kenneth explicitly stated that Westfield Industries selected Hammond and Pierce because of your specific expertise and methodological approach. He views our organizational changes as potentially jeopardizing their transformation implementation." The situation was developing precisely as I had anticipated, though with greater velocity than expected. Kenneth was using Westfield's economic leverage to influence Hammond and Pierce's internal decisions, a highly unusual client intervention in professional services relationships. "I assume you've explained that Richard brings considerable expertise that will benefit Westfield's implementation," I suggested, maintaining appropriate advocacy for Hammond and Pierce despite my changed circumstances. Victor's expression suggested limited confidence in this approach. "We've emphasized Richard's qualifications, of course. Kenneth acknowledges his credentials, but remains concerned about methodological alignment with Westfield's transformation philosophy. Which is why you proposed the consulting arrangement," I noted, bringing the conversation back to its practical purpose. "Yes," Victor confirmed. "Though in light of Kenneth's continued concerns, we'd like to amend the proposal to offer greater scope and duration." He retrieved a folder from the side table and handed it to me. "This revised agreement extends the engagement to 12 months with expanded responsibilities and corresponding compensation adjustment." I accepted the folder without opening it, maintaining professional neutrality. "I'll review the revised terms carefully. However, I should mention that I've received several other professional opportunities that may impact my availability for extended consulting work." Victor's expression tightened slightly at this information. "May I ask the nature of these opportunities?" "They include board directorship consideration, private equity advisory roles, and potential academic affiliation," I replied, providing general categories without specific organizational details. "I'm evaluating various options for my professional future." The revelation clearly concerned him, though he attempted to maintain composed negotiation demeanor. "All impressive possibilities," he acknowledged. "However, I hope you'll consider our revised proposal seriously. We're prepared to be extremely flexible regarding terms to retain your expertise during this critical transition period." "I appreciate the consideration," I responded diplomatically. "I'll review the proposal thoroughly before making any decisions." Our conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Victor emphasizing Hammond and Pierce's newfound appreciation for my strategic capabilities and willingness to structure arrangements that would benefit all parties. Throughout, I maintained professional courtesy while committing only to thoughtful consideration rather than specific agreement. At 10:55 a.m., we concluded our discussion and walked together to the main boardroom where Kenneth Westfield would be arriving momentarily. Richard and Andrea were already seated at the massive oak table, their expressions suggesting the strain of managing an increasingly unpredictable situation. At precisely 11 a.m., Kenneth Westfield entered the boardroom with characteristic punctuality. At 64, he carried himself with the confident directness of someone whose position afforded the luxury of unfiltered communication. "Thank you all for accommodating this meeting on short notice," he began without preamble once introductions had been completed. "I felt it necessary to discuss Westfield Industries' strategic consulting relationship with Hammond and Pierce directly, given the organizational changes you've implemented this week." Victor adopted his most reassuring client management tone. "We appreciate your engagement, Kenneth. Hammond and Pierce remains fully committed to Westfield's transformation implementation. While we're making some internal structural adjustments, Richard brings exceptional expertise that will ensure continuity and enhancement of our strategic support." Kenneth's expression suggested limited interest in these assurances. "Let me be direct, as time is valuable for everyone in this room. Westfield Industries engaged Hammond and Pierce 3 years ago specifically because of Catherine's methodological approach and manufacturing transformation expertise. Our board approved an $80 million consulting engagement based on that specific strategic philosophy." The room fell silent as Kenneth continued. "The organizational changes you've announced this week appear fundamentally misaligned with the methodological approach our transformation requires. This creates significant concern regarding implementation continuity." Victor attempted to recalibrate the conversation toward constructive resolution. "We understand your concerns, Kenneth, which is why we've proposed a consulting arrangement with Catherine to ensure seamless transition while Richard assumes primary relationship responsibility." Kenneth's expression hardened slightly. "I'm aware of your consulting proposal. Catherine mentioned it during our dinner Wednesday evening." The revelation of our dinner meeting clearly surprised Hammond and Pierce leadership, though they maintained professional composure. Kenneth had deliberately introduced this information to establish that discussions were occurring outside institutional boundaries, a power move that shifted conversational leverage. "What concerns me," Kenneth continued, "is that Hammond and Pierce appears to be treating as dispensable the very expertise that prompted our engagement with your firm. This suggests fundamental misalignment between your organizational priorities and Westfield's transformation requirements." The boardroom remained silent as the implications of Kenneth's assessment registered with Hammond and Pierce leadership. He wasn't merely expressing concern about implementation continuity, he was questioning the firm's basic understanding of why Westfield had selected them in the first place. "We value Catherine's expertise tremendously," Richard interjected, attempting to redirect the conversation. "Our proposed consulting arrangement reflects that appreciation and ensures her continued involvement throughout the transition period." Kenneth turned his attention directly to Richard. "Mr. Morgan, I reviewed your background thoroughly after learning of your appointment. Your work at Apex Consulting emphasized visibility milestones and market positioning over operational transformation. Precisely the approach Westfield explicitly rejected before engaging Hammond and Pierce." The directness of this assessment visibly unsettled Richard, who had clearly not anticipated such specific critique of his professional methodology from a client he had yet to formally engage with. "Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting," Kenneth continued, turning his attention back to Victor and Andrea. "Westfield Industries needs to determine whether our strategic transformation objectives remain alignable with Hammond and Pierce's evolving approach." The Hammond and Pierce boardroom fell silent as Kenneth Westfield's words hung in the air. The one implication was unmistakable. Westfield Industries was reconsidering their $80 million engagement based on the firm's organizational decisions. For a consultancy that had built its reputation on strategic excellence, the potential loss of their flagship client represented not just financial impact, but reputational damage that could affect relationships across their entire client portfolio. Victor Hammond recovered first, his decades of experience in navigating difficult client conversations evident in his measured response. "Kenneth, we absolutely understand your concerns about methodological alignment. Hammond and Pierce remains fully committed to Westfield's transformation objectives with the approach that has proven successful over the past 3 years." "Commitment requires consistency," Kenneth replied, his gaze steady. "The abrupt removal of the strategic architect who designed our transformation framework suggests priorities other than implementation excellence." Andrea Pierce, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "We recognize that Catherine has been instrumental in developing Westfield's strategic framework. Our proposed consulting arrangement is specifically designed to maintain that continuity while broadening the expertise available to support your implementation." Kenneth turned his attention directly to me, effectively sidelining Hammond and Pierce leadership from the conversation. "Catherine, you've maintained professional diplomacy throughout this situation, which I respect. However, I'd appreciate your candid assessment of whether the proposed arrangement would provide the strategic continuity Westfield requires." The question placed me in a delicate position. Professional ethics demanded I support Hammond and Pierce's client relationships regardless of my changing status with the firm. Yet I also owed Kenneth the honest assessment he was seeking about implementation risks during leadership transition. "The proposed consulting arrangement would certainly provide implementation continuity during the transition period," I began carefully. "The comprehensive documentation we've developed ensures methodological consistency, and Richard brings valuable perspective that may enhance certain aspects of the implementation." Kenneth's expression suggested he recognized the diplomatic balancing in my response. "And beyond the transition period, our transformation timeline extends another 30 months. What happens when your consulting arrangement concludes?" Before I could formulate an appropriate response, Victor interjected. "We're prepared to extend Catherine's consulting engagement to align with Westfield's full implementation timeline. Hammond and Pierce is committed to whatever arrangement ensures your satisfaction with our services." The desperation beneath Victor's offer was barely concealed. What had begun Tuesday as my dismissal had transformed by Friday into increasingly expansive efforts to retain my involvement specifically to protect their largest client relationship. Kenneth appeared unmoved by the concession. "That addresses implementation continuity, but not the fundamental concern about Hammond and Pierce's strategic direction. If expertise like Catherine's is considered dispensable, what does that indicate about your firm's valuation of substantive transformation versus market positioning?" The question cut to the heart of the matter. Kenneth wasn't merely concerned about his specific project, but was questioning Hammond and Pierce's entire strategic philosophy. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that his appointment symbolized precisely the shift in priorities Kenneth was critiquing. "Perhaps I might offer a perspective," I suggested, sensing an opportunity to facilitate productive resolution rather than allowing the situation to deteriorate further. Consulting firms naturally evolve their methodological approach over time. Hammond and Pierce is adapting to changing market conditions while maintaining the implementation excellence that has characterized the firm's work with Westfield. Victor seized the diplomatic opening I had provided. "Exactly right. Our organizational adjustments reflect evolving market positioning, while our commitment to implementation substance remains unwavering." Kenneth's expression suggested limited persuasion. Implementation substance was precisely what distinguished Catherine's approach from competitors we rejected 3 years ago. If Hammond and Pierce is now prioritizing market positioning over implementation methodology, that represents material change to the basis of our engagement. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, Kenneth systematically dismantling Hammond and Pierce's assurances, while firm leadership offered increasingly expansive concessions regarding my continued involvement. Throughout, I maintained professional balance, neither undermining Hammond and Pierce's position nor providing false assurances about implementation continuity. At 11:45 a.m., Kenneth consulted his watch and announced he had another commitment. I appreciate everyone's time this morning. I'll be discussing these developments with our executive committee on Monday. In the meantime, he added, turning to me, our board nomination committee would still like to meet with you next week, Catherine. My assistant will coordinate scheduling. The revelation of the board directorship consideration clearly surprised Hammond and Pierce leadership, though they maintained professional composure. Kenneth had deliberately introduced this information to establish that my professional relationship with Westfield extended beyond my Hammond and Pierce affiliation, another calculated shift in conversational leverage. As Kenneth departed, the boardroom remained silent for several moments. Victor finally broke the tension, turning to me with an expression I had never seen during our 15-year professional relationship, one that blended concern with genuine respect. Catherine, I believe we need to reconsider Tuesday's organizational decision, he said, the corporate euphemisms now abandoned in favor of direct communication. Hammond and Pierce would like to reinstate your position with expanded responsibilities and appropriate adjustment to compensation and title. The offer represented complete reversal of Tuesday's dismissal, a validation not through institutional recognition of my value, but through external client insistence on my essentiality. While the professional vindication carried certain satisfaction, I recognized that fundamentally nothing had changed about Hammond and Pierce's strategic direction or valuation of my methodological approach. They were simply responding to economic pressure, rather than reconsidering their institutional priorities. I appreciate the consideration, I replied carefully. However, circumstances have evolved considerably since Tuesday. I've received several professional opportunities that warrant serious evaluation before making any commitments regarding my future relationship with Hammond and Pierce. Andrea's expression tightened slightly at this response. She had clearly anticipated that reinstatement would be immediately accepted given the circumstances of my dismissal. We understand you may have received other offers, she acknowledged. Hammond and Pierce is prepared to be extremely competitive regarding terms. It's not merely about terms, I clarified. It's about fundamental alignment between my professional approach and institutional priorities. Tuesday's decision reflected Hammond and Pierce's strategic direction. External circumstances may have changed the economic calculation, but the underlying philosophical misalignment likely remains. Victor recognized the substance beneath my diplomatic phrasing. Would you be willing to discuss what specific conditions would make reinstatement attractive given how circumstances have evolved? He asked, abandoning pretense that this was anything but a negotiation between equal parties. I would need to consider that question carefully, I replied honestly. When we conclude our formal relationship this afternoon, I'll take the weekend to evaluate all options before responding to any specific proposals. The meeting concluded with carefully calibrated professional courtesy, Hammond and Pierce leadership, understanding that the leverage had fundamentally shifted, while I maintained appropriate boundaries regarding future commitments. As we left the boardroom, Richard asked if he might speak with me privately. Of course, I agreed, leading him to my office where we could continue the conversation away from curious observers. Once the door closed behind us, Richard's carefully maintained composure partially dissolved. I underestimated the situation entirely, he admitted with surprising candor. When Victor and Andrea described the Westfield relationship during my recruitment, they characterized it as institutionally secured rather than personally dependent. The admission confirmed what I had suspected. Hammond and Pierce leadership had systematically undervalued the relationship capital that secured their largest client engagement, attributing to institutional brand what actually reflected personal trust developed through years of substantive delivery. Client relationships in strategic consulting are always blended, I observed diplomatically. Institutional methodology provides foundation, but implementation always depends on individual expertise and relationship trust. Richard nodded, running a hand through his meticulously styled hair, a gesture that seemed to be his unconscious response to situations beyond his careful control. I've inherited an impossible situation, he said with unexpected vulnerability. Regardless of what arrangement is made with you, Kenneth clearly doesn't trust my methodological approach. The assessment was accurate, though surprisingly self-aware. Rather than defaulting to defensive posturing, Richard was acknowledging the fundamental misalignment Kenneth had identified so directly. Trust can be established through demonstrated delivery, I suggested, offering constructive perspective rather than validation of his concerns. Kenneth values substantive implementation over market positioning, but he's not opposed to innovative approaches that deliver measurable outcomes. Richard studied me with new appreciation, perhaps finally recognizing the subtle relationship, management capabilities that had secured Westfield's engagement despite my less commanding presentation style. Would you be willing to provide guidance on approaching the relationship effectively? Regardless of what formal arrangement is established, I could use your insights. The request reflected professional humility that contradicted my initial assessment of Richard's character. Perhaps his confidence masked greater depth than I had recognized during our limited interactions. I'm happy to share perspective on the Westfield relationship, regardless of formal arrangements, I assured him. Their transformation success ultimately benefits everyone involved. Our conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Richard asking increasingly substantive questions about Kenneth's decision-making priorities and implementation expectations. Throughout, I provided candid guidance focused on relationship effectiveness rather than personal advancement, maintaining the professional integrity that had characterized my entire Hammond and Pierce tenure. At 1 p.m., I departed for my lunch, meeting with Professor Eleanor Mitchell, leaving Hammond and Pierce temporarily behind both physically and mentally. The elegant sophistication of Meridian Restaurant provided welcome contrast to the boardroom tensions of the morning. Eleanor greeted me with the warm professionalism that had characterized our relationship since my MBA days. At 68, she remained one of Wharton's most respected faculty members, having pioneered methodologies for organizational transformation that formed the theoretical foundation of my practical approach. "Catherine," she said as we settled at our table overlooking the city park, "perfect timing for reconnection given what I'm hearing about your Hammond and Pierce situation." I raised an eyebrow, surprised that news had traveled so quickly beyond the firm. "You've heard about this week's developments?" She smiled with the knowing expression of someone whose network extended throughout the business community. "Kenneth Westfield called me yesterday. We've known each other for decades. I advised his father during Westfield's first major reorganization in the 1980s. Kenneth wanted my assessment of whether your methodological approach could translate effectively to governance perspective. The information was surprising, though it explained the timing of Eleanor's lunch invitation. "And your assessment?" I asked, genuinely curious about her professional evaluation. "That your analytical rigor and implementation focus would bring valuable perspective to their board," she replied directly. "Though I also suggested he consider the potential value of your expertise in broader application beyond a single organization. Which relates to the Wharton executive education opportunity you mentioned," I prompted, sensing the connection. "Precisely," Eleanor confirmed. "We're establishing a new Center for Implementation Strategy focused on translating theoretical frameworks into practical transformation methodologies. The founding director position requires someone with substantial practical experience implementing complex organizational change across multiple industries." The opportunity was intriguing, a chance to codify the methodological approach I had developed over decades of practical application, potentially influencing implementation strategy across organizations, rather than one client engagement at a time. The position would include faculty appointment, executive education leadership, and significant corporate advisory capacity, Eleanor continued. Essentially formalizing what you've been doing throughout your career, but with institutional, platform, and broader influence scope. As our lunch conversation progressed, Eleanor outlined the center's vision, bridging academic rigor with practical implementation to develop next-generation transformation methodologies. The role represented not just professional continuation, but potential expansion of impact beyond what traditional consulting structures permitted. I've recommended you as the ideal founding director, Eleanor concluded as our lunch neared its end. The search committee would like to meet with you next week if you're interested in exploring the opportunity. I'm definitely interested, I confirmed, the possibilities already forming into structured assessment in my analytical approach to decision-making. Though I should mention I'm evaluating several options currently, including potential board, directorship, and private equity advisory roles. Eleanor's expression suggested this information reinforced rather than diminished her recommendation. Multiple application contexts would actually strengthen your contribution to the center's work, she observed. We're seeking someone who can translate implementation methodology across governance, operational, and advisory dimensions. By the time our lunch concluded, I had committed to meeting with the search committee the following week, while maintaining appropriate transparency about other opportunities under consideration. The center directorship represented an intriguing integration of various professional components: academic rigor, practical application, and governance perspective, combined into coherent professional identity. Returning to Hammond and Pierce. For my final afternoon, I found a message from Victor requesting a brief meeting before my departure. At 4:30 p.m., I made my way to his office for what would effectively be my exit conversation after 15 years with the firm. "Catherine," he greeted me, rising from behind his desk with the formal courtesy he typically reserved for important clients. "Thank you for making time before your departure." "Of course," I replied, taking the offered seat across from him. The subtle power dynamics of the arrangement, him behind the desk, me in the visitor's chair, seemed almost anachronistic given the fundamental leverage shift that had occurred throughout the day. Victor appeared to recognize this himself, moving from behind the desk to join me in the seating area, a symbolic adjustment to our changed professional relationship. I wanted to personally acknowledge how significantly circumstances have evolved since Tuesday's conversation, he began, abandoning corporate euphemisms for direct communication. Hammond and Pierce made a serious error in judgment regarding your value to the firm and our client relationships. The admission was remarkable coming from someone who had built his professional reputation on strategic decisiveness. "I appreciate the candor," I replied, neither accepting nor dismissing the implied apology. "We'd like to formally offer reinstatement. With substantial promotion," Victor continued, handing me a folder containing the proposal. "Executive partner position with direct board reporting relationship, compensation adjustment reflecting your strategic value, and authority to shape methodological approach across the firm's strategic consulting practice." The offer represented everything I had worked toward during my Hammond and Pierce tenure: senior leadership position, methodological authority, appropriate recognition of my contribution to the firm's success. Yet it arrived not through institutional recognition of my value, but through external client insistence on my essentiality. "I appreciate the consideration," I replied, accepting the folder without opening it. "As I mentioned this morning, I'll need to evaluate all options carefully before making any decisions about future professional direction." Victor nodded, clearly understanding that the dynamics had permanently shifted regardless of what arrangement might eventually be established. "May I ask what other opportunities you're considering? Perhaps we can structure an arrangement that accommodates multiple professional components. They include board directorship consideration, private equity advisory roles, and potential academic leadership position," I replied, providing general categories without specific organizational details. I'm evaluating how these components might integrate into coherent professional identity rather than viewing them as competing alternatives. This perspective clearly intrigued Victor, who had always operated within traditional corporate structures, rather than portfolio approaches to professional contribution. An integrated model, rather than singular institutional affiliation, he observed thoughtfully. Interesting approach to professional identity. Our conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Victor expressing genuine interest in how multiple professional components might be structured to provide both independence and institutional support. Throughout, I maintained thoughtful engagement while committing only to careful consideration rather than specific direction. As our meeting concluded, Victor walked me to the office door, a courtesy that symbolized our recalibrated professional relationship. "Whatever arrangement emerges from your consideration," he said as we shook hands, "I hope Hammond and Pierce can remain part of your professional portfolio moving forward." "I'll evaluate all options carefully," I assured him, including the generous reinstatement offer. My final task before departing Hammond and Pierce was gathering the few remaining personal items from my office. Jessica had already packed most belongings earlier in the week, leaving only the crystal paperweight my father had given me upon MBA graduation. As I lifted the paperweight from my desk, I noticed a handwritten note beneath it, unusual in our predominantly digital communication environment. The message was from Jessica, her precise handwriting immediately recognizable. "Whatever path you choose next, it will be illuminated by the quiet excellence that has always distinguished your work. The institutional structures that failed to properly value your contributions don't define your professional worth. Your true legacy at Hammond and Pierce exists in the minds of those you've mentored, the clients whose organizations you've transformed, and the methodological approach you've pioneered. Those endure regardless of titles or organizational decisions." The note captured precisely what I had been formulating throughout this remarkable week: that professional identity exists beyond institutional boundaries, that expertise creates value regardless of organizational affiliation, and that impact outlasts the structures through which it's temporarily channeled. As I left the Hammond and Pierce offices for the final time that Friday evening, I carried not the weight of professional dismissal, but the lightness of expanded possibility. What had begun as organizational rejection had transformed into remarkable validation, not just from Kenneth Westfield's direct intervention, but from the multiple professional opportunities that had emerged once institutional constraints were removed. The farewell gathering my team had organized at Riverview Restaurant provided perfect bookend to the extraordinary week. 20 colleagues, current and former team members I had mentored throughout my Hammond and Pierce tenure, gathered to celebrate not what was ending but what had been built during 15 years of collaborative excellence. Michael Chen, my longest-serving team member, offered a toast that captured the evening's sentiment. To Catherine, who taught us that leadership isn't about commanding attention, but creating environments where substantive excellence thrives. Your approach may not have aligned with Hammond and Pierce's evolving priorities, but it established standards that will guide our work regardless of organizational direction. The gathering continued long into the evening, with conversation flowing, from professional reflection to future possibilities. Several team members expressed interest in maintaining professional connection, regardless of where my next chapter might lead. Evidence that relationships built on substantive contribution transcend organizational boundaries. By the time I returned home that night, my perspective had crystallized with remarkable clarity. What had initially appeared as professional setback had revealed itself as catalyst for something far more significant: the emergence of integrated professional identity defined by expertise rather than institutional affiliation. I moved to my home office and began creating the structured framework that would guide my weekend evaluation of the multiple opportunities now available. The Hammond and Pierce reinstatement offer would be considered alongside Kenneth's board directorship, Eleanor's academic leadership position, Franklin's private equity advisory role, and other possibilities that had emerged throughout the week. The assessment wouldn't focus on selecting a single path, but on how these components might integrate into coherent professional expression, applying my strategic methodologies across multiple contexts with greater independence and broader impact than any singular institutional role could provide. As I worked into the early morning hours, my phone chimed with an unexpected text message from Kenneth Westfield. Confirmed Monday meeting with Executive Committee. They're prepared to transition Hammond and Pierce engagement to direct advisory. Relationship with you if you're amenable. Either way, board nomination proceeding as discussed. Let me know your thoughts after weekend consideration. The message represented final confirmation of the remarkable leverage shift that had occurred throughout the week, from dismissed employee to essential relationship that transcended institutional boundaries. The Hammond and Pierce engagement that had been secured through my expertise could apparently follow that expertise regardless of organizational affiliation. I added this development to my evaluation framework, recognizing that it fundamentally changed the calculation regarding Hammond and Pierce's reinstatement offer. If Westfield's engagement could transition to direct advisory relationship, the economics of independent practice became immediately viable rather than theoretically possible. Before finally retiring for the night, I sent a brief message to Eleanor. Mitchell. Lunch conversation continues to resonate. Very interested in further discussion about center directorship, particularly how it might accommodate complementary advisory and governance roles. Available for search committee meeting Tuesday if that timing works. As I finally prepared for sleep after the most extraordinary professional week of my career, I found myself reflecting on the conversation with my father shortly before his passing. The mistake I made, he had told me, was believing that excellence alone was sufficient protection. I built something valuable but failed to secure my position within it. I now understood his insight with newfound clarity. Excellence creates value, but institutional structures often fail to properly recognize that value until external validation forces reassessment. My father had built his professional identity within singular organizational context, making him vulnerable to institutional decisions beyond his control. The path emerging before me offered different possibility. Professional identity constructed across multiple contexts, applied through various relationship structures, independent of any single institutional affiliation. The expertise Hammond and Pierce had deemed insufficiently aligned with their strategic direction on Tuesday had by Friday become the foundation for entirely new professional architecture, one built on substance rather than structure, on expertise rather than affiliation, on impact rather than title. Whatever specific configuration emerged from weekend consideration, the fundamental transformation had already occurred. The dismissal that had been intended to remove me from institutional leadership had instead liberated me from institutional constraints, revealing possibilities for impact and contribution far beyond what traditional corporate structures typically permit. The architect whose blueprints had been rejected by the builders had discovered she could design and construct her own professional edifice, one whose foundation rested not on organizational legitimacy, but on the substantive excellence that had always defined her work, now finally recognized for its true and enduring value. The weekend following my final day at Hammond and Pierce provided essential space for methodical evaluation of the extraordinary opportunities that had emerged. During the week, I approached this assessment with the same structured analysis I had applied to client challenges throughout my career: comprehensive framework, weighted criteria, and scenario modeling to evaluate various configurations of professional possibilities. Saturday. Morning found me at my dining room table surrounded by precisely arranged documents: the Hammond and Pierce reinstatement offer, Kenneth's board directorship proposal, Eleanor's academic leadership opportunity, and Franklin's private equity advisory invitation. Rather than viewing these as competing alternatives requiring singular selection, I analyzed how they might function as integrated components of a coherent professional architecture. By mid-afternoon, a clear pattern had emerged from my analysis. The traditional career paradigm of exclusive institutional affiliation, trading expertise for organizational legitimacy and structured advancement, no longer represented optimal application of my professional capabilities. The events of the past week had demonstrated that expertise could transcend institutional boundaries when properly valued by those who recognized its substantive impact. I created a comprehensive model for what this integrated professional identity might entail, an approach that applied strategic expertise across multiple contexts while maintaining independent judgment and methodological integrity. The framework included governance perspective through board directorship, practical implementation through selective advisory relationships, and knowledge dissemination through academic affiliation. At 4:30 p.m., my analysis was interrupted by an unexpected call from Richard Morgan. I hesitated briefly before answering, uncertain what further negotiation Hammond and Pierce might be attempting through their newest executive. "Catherine," Richard began, his tone notably different from our previous interactions, less performatively confident, more genuinely engaged. "I apologize for interrupting your weekend. I was hoping we might have an off-the-record conversation about the Westfield situation." "I'm listening," I replied, maintaining neutral professionalism while curious about this unscheduled outreach. "I've spent the day reviewing the complete Westfield implementation documentation," he explained. "The methodological approach you've developed is remarkable, particularly the integration between operational transformation and governance evolution. It's substantially different from anything I implemented at Apex." The acknowledgement was surprising given Richard's previous positioning as strategic enhancement to Hammond and Pierce's capabilities. "Different methodological approaches serve different transformation contexts," I observed diplomatically. "Apex's visibility-first strategy has its applications in certain organizational environments." "That's precisely what I've been reflecting on today," Richard continued with unexpected candor. "The approach that succeeded in my previous experiences is fundamentally misaligned with Westfield's transformation requirements." Kenneth was entirely correct in his assessment yesterday. This level of self-awareness represented significant departure from the confident certainty Richard had projected during our initial interactions. "Strategic consulting effectiveness depends on methodological alignment with specific organizational contexts," I acknowledged. "Recognizing misalignment is the first step toward developing appropriate approach." "Which is why I'm calling," Richard explained. "I've spoken with Victor about restructuring our relationship with Westfield, regardless of what arrangement you ultimately establish with Hammond and Pierce. If you're willing, I'd like to learn your methodological approach rather than imposing frameworks that serve different contexts." The request reflected professional humility I hadn't previously observed in Richard's interactions, a willingness to recognize limitations and adapt perspective rather than maintaining rigid attachment to familiar approaches. "I appreciate your candor," I replied honestly. "Westfield's transformation requires methodological continuity, regardless of which individuals or organizations provide implementation support. I'm happy to share perspective on the approach I've developed if that ensures their continued success." Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Richard asking increasingly substantive questions about the philosophical foundation of my implementation methodology. Throughout, he demonstrated genuine engagement with the conceptual framework, rather than performative interest calculated to secure relationship continuity. As our call concluded, Richard offered an observation that suggested deeper reflection than I had previously attributed to him. "Hammond and Pierce made a fundamental error in how they evaluated your contribution," he said with remarkable directness. "They measured presence instead of impact, visibility instead of value. Whatever you decide about their reinstatement offer, that philosophical misalignment likely remains." The assessment echoed my own analysis regarding Hammond and Pierce's organizational direction. that Tuesday's dismissal had reflected genuine misalignment with my methodological approach rather than mere miscalculation about client relationships. Richard's recognition of this fundamental disconnect suggested greater perceptiveness than his initially performative demeanor had indicated. After the call ended, I returned to my structured evaluation with renewed clarity about the nature of institutional relationships. Organizations inherently value what they measure. Hammond and Pierce had measured presence, projection, and visibility rather than substantive impact, transformative methodology, and implementation excellence. The reinstatement offer reflected economic necessity rather than philosophical realignment. By Sunday afternoon, my evaluation had coalesced into strategic framework with multiple configuration options depending on how various opportunities evolved in the coming weeks. The model maintained important flexibility while establishing clear parameters regarding professional integration, time allocation, and philosophical alignment. At 5:00 p.m., I sent 3 carefully crafted emails representing initial responses to the primary opportunities. The first went to Victor Hammond regarding the reinstatement offer, expressing appreciation for the consideration while requesting in-person discussion Tuesday afternoon to explore potential consulting relationship structure rather than traditional employment arrangement. This approach established clear boundary regarding institutional affiliation while maintaining possibility of continued professional collaboration. The second went to Kenneth Westfield, confirming my availability for Monday's executive committee meeting and expressing interest in the board directorship nomination. I also indicated openness to discussing direct advisory relationship structure, depending on the committee's decision regarding Hammond and Pierce engagement transition. The third went to Eleanor Mitchell, confirming Tuesday's meeting with the Center Directorship Search Committee and requesting additional information about how the position might accommodate complementary advisory and governance roles. This maintained momentum on the academic affiliation while establishing parameters regarding professional integration. With these initial responses dispatched, I spent the remainder of Sunday evening preparing detailed analysis of Westfield's implementation progress for Monday's executive committee meeting. Their transformation had reached critical inflection point, where operational improvements needed to translate into governance evolution, precisely the transition phase where strategic continuity proved most essential. Monday morning arrived with unusual clarity, both literal in the crystalline October sky visible from my apartment windows and figurative in the focused purpose I felt regarding the day's pivotal conversations. The methodical analysis conducted over the weekend had distilled complex possibilities into strategic framework for evaluating opportunities against consistent criteria rather than reactive responses to rapidly evolving circumstances. I dressed with particular care for the Westfield Executive Committee meeting, selecting a charcoal gray suit whose understated elegance reflected my preference for substance over presentation. Professional appearance mattered, of course, but as component of comprehensive credibility rather than substitute for substantive expertise. The Westfield Industries headquarters occupied a 15-story building downtown, its architecture blending modern functionality with subtle references to the company's manufacturing heritage. The executive floor maintained similar balance, contemporary design elements incorporated alongside historical photographs, documenting the company's 7-decade evolution from regional manufacturer to international industrial conglomerate. Kenneth greeted me personally when I arrived for the 10 a.m. meeting, escorting me to the executive boardroom where 7 committee members awaited our arrival. The composition reflected Westfield's governance tradition, a blend of family representatives, industry veterans, and subject matter experts collectively responsible for strategic oversight of the company's global operations. Thank you all for accommodating this special meeting, Kenneth began once introductions had been completed. As you know, we've encountered significant developments regarding our strategic consulting relationship with Hammond and Pierce. I've asked Catherine to join us today to provide her perspective on implementation continuity given these organizational changes. For the next 30 minutes, I presented comprehensive analysis of Westfield's transformation progress, highlighting critical achievements during initial implementation phases while identifying essential priorities for the governance evolution. Now beginning. Throughout, I maintained professional objectivity regarding Hammond and Pierce's organizational changes while providing candid assessment of potential implementation risks during leadership transition. When I concluded, William Thornton, Westfield's longest-serving executive committee member at 72, asked the question that clearly occupied everyone's attention. Given Hammond and Pierce's organizational decisions and subsequent attempts at correction, what arrangement would best serve Westfield's implementation requirements moving forward? The directness of his inquiry created perfect opening to address the situation's fundamental dynamics. Successful implementation depends on methodological continuity, regardless of which individuals or organizations provide strategic support. I replied. Westfield's transformation requires specific approach that prioritizes operational substance over market perception, exactly the philosophy that guided our engagement from the beginning. Kenneth nodded his agreement before addressing his colleagues. Which brings us to the decision before this committee. Hammond and Pierce has offered Catherine reinstatement with expanded responsibilities, clearly attempting to preserve our engagement relationship. Alternatively, we could transition to direct advisory relationship with Catherine while maintaining Hammond and Pierce involvement for specific implementation components. Both approaches have different implications for our transformation governance. What followed was remarkably candid discussion of the relative merits of various relationship structures. Institutional engagement with Hammond and Pierce versus direct advisory relationship with me as independent strategist. Throughout, committee members demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how consulting relationships influence implementation outcomes, particularly during complex transformations requiring sustained methodological consistency. After 40 minutes of thorough deliberation, Kenneth called for committee decision. The vote was unanimous. Westfield Industries would transition primary strategic relationship to direct advisory engagement with me while maintaining Hammond and Pierce involvement for specific implementation components where their institutional capabilities provided necessary support. Catherine, Kenneth said once the vote had been recorded, we would like to offer you exclusive strategic advisory relationship for the remainder of Westfield's transformation implementation, with corresponding adjustment to compensation structure, reflecting your independent status. Additionally, the committee reaffirms its nomination of you to Westfield's Board of Directors, with formal elections scheduled for next month's shareholder meeting. The dual relationship, strategic advisor and board director, represented unprecedented governance approach for Westfield Industries, which had traditionally maintained clear separation between implementation support and oversight responsibility. The innovation reflected their commitment to methodological continuity during critical transformation phases, regardless of traditional structural boundaries. I appreciate the committee's confidence, I responded, maintaining professional composure despite the significant validation this decision represented. Westfield's transformation success has always been my primary objective, regardless of institutional affiliation. I would be honored to continue supporting implementation in whatever capacity best serves your organizational objectives. The remainder of the meeting addressed practical transition considerations, contractual structures, communication approach with Hammond and Pierce, and implementation team continuity. Throughout, committee members demonstrated remarkable focus on substantive outcomes rather than relationship politics, reinforcing why Westfield had achieved such significant transformation progress despite complex industry challenges. As the meeting concluded, Kenneth asked me to remain behind for brief conversation once other committee members had departed. When we were alone in the boardroom, his professional demeanor softened slightly into the more direct communication style I had come to appreciate during our 3-year working relationship. That went precisely as expected, he said with characteristic straightforwardness. The committee recognized months ago that your expertise represented Westfield's primary value from the Hammond and Pierce engagement. Tuesday's organizational decision simply accelerated transition we had already been considering. The revelation was surprising, that Westfield leadership had been evaluating relationship restructuring before Hammond and Pierce's dismissal decision, recognizing the misalignment between institutional priorities and transformation requirements. Hammond and Pierce provides valuable implementation support, I acknowledged, maintaining professional balance despite this unexpected information. Their methodological approach has contributed significantly to Westfield's transformation progress. Their methodology was your methodology, Kenneth corrected with typical directness. The firm provided infrastructure and implementation resources, but the strategic architecture came from your expertise. That's what we're securing through this relationship restructuring, continuity of the methodological approach that has proven successful regardless of institutional affiliation. His assessment aligned perfectly with the professional identity framework I had developed during weekend analysis. That expertise creates value independent of organizational structures, particularly when that expertise addresses complex challenges, requiring methodological innovation rather than standardized approaches. I should mention that I'm considering several complementary professional components, I explained, maintaining appropriate transparency regarding other opportunities. These include potential academic affiliation and selected advisory relationships with non-competing organizations. Any arrangement with Westfield would need to accommodate these integrated elements. Rather than expressing concern about divided attention, Kenneth appeared genuinely interested in this portfolio approach to professional contribution. That structure actually enhances your value to Westfield, he observed thoughtfully. Cross-sectoral application of transformation methodologies provides perspective that purely commercial consulting often lacks. Our governance nominations specifically anticipated your broader professional engagement beyond Westfield advisory responsibilities. As I left Westfield headquarters that morning, I experienced profound validation not just of my strategic expertise, but of the integrated professional model I had conceptualized during weekend analysis. Kenneth and the executive committee hadn't merely selected my capabilities over Hammond and Pierce's institutional structure. They had actively embraced the multidimensional professional identity I was constructing beyond traditional organizational boundaries. At 1 p.m., I called Victor Hammond to reschedule our Tuesday meeting, recognizing that Westfield's decision fundamentally changed the context for any discussion about my relationship with Hammond and Pierce. His assistant indicated he was unavailable, but Richard Morgan called back within 15 minutes. Victor mentioned you were rescheduling tomorrow's meeting, Richard said when I answered. I assume that relates to this morning's Westfield Executive Committee decision? The question confirmed that news had already reached Hammond and Pierce leadership, unsurprising given the significance of the client relationship and the broader business community's interest in such developments. Yes, I confirmed directly. Westfield has decided to restructure their strategic consulting relationship. They've offered me independent advisory engagement while maintaining Hammond and Pierce involvement for specific implementation components. Richard's response suggested he had anticipated this outcome following our weekend conversation. They've made rational decision given the circumstances, he observed with surprising equanimity. Methodological continuity clearly outweighed institutional relationship in their assessment. Hammond and Pierce remains valuable implementation partner, I emphasized, maintaining professional support for the firm despite my changing relationship. Westfield specifically wants to maintain your involvement in operational components where the firm's resources provide necessary support. But primary strategic oversight transitions to you independently, Richard completed the thought, his tone reflecting professional resignation rather than personal disappointment. Perfectly logical structure given the situation's evolution. We discussed practical transition considerations for several minutes before Richard raised the question Hammond and Pierce leadership was undoubtedly focusing on. How does this development affect your consideration of our reinstatement offer? It fundamentally changes the discussion context, I replied honestly. Rather than reinstatement, we should explore potential collaborative relationship between my independent advisory practice and Hammond and Pierce for implementation support on selected engagements. I'm still interested in meeting tomorrow to discuss this alternative structure if that holds potential value. Richard agreed to coordinate. Revised meeting with Victor and Andrea focused on collaborative relationship rather than organizational reintegration. The conversation concluded with remarkable professionalism given the significance of the relationship restructuring occurring, evidence that Richard possessed greater adaptability than his initially performative demeanor had suggested. The remainder of Monday was devoted to preparing for Tuesday's meetings. The center directorship discussion with Eleanor's search committee in the morning, followed by the recalibrated conversation with Hammond and Pierce leadership in the afternoon. Both discussions would help refine the integrated professional model taking shape through sequential decisions about relationship structures and engagement parameters. Tuesday morning's meeting at Wharton exceeded expectations regarding potential academic affiliation. The search committee demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how the center directorship might complement, rather than compete with advisory and governance responsibilities. The position's structural flexibility, 70% time commitment with concentrated teaching responsibilities and research support for methodological development, aligned perfectly with the integrated professional model I had conceptualized. By meeting's conclusion, mutual interest had been firmly established. The committee would recommend my appointment as founding director with formal offer anticipated within 2 weeks. The position would begin next semester, providing appropriate transition time for establishing independent advisory practice and integrating board responsibilities. The afternoon meeting with Hammond and Pierce leadership carried entirely different character from what had originally been scheduled. Instead of discussing reinstatement terms, we focused on potential collaborative relationship between my independent practice and their implementation capabilities. Victor and Andrea initially attempted to reconceptualize their reinstatement offer as partnership structure that would maintain institutional affiliation while permitting external professional engagements. The proposal reflected creative attempt to preserve relationship despite fundamentally changed circumstances. I appreciate the consideration, I responded diplomatically. But Westfield's decision and my other professional commitments suggest different structural relationship. Hammond and Pierce provides valuable implementation capabilities that complement strategic oversight. The opportunity is establishing collaborative relationship that leverages respective strengths without requiring institutional integration. Richard, surprisingly, provided support for this alternative approach. Catherine's methodological expertise clearly transcends institutional boundaries, he observed with remarkable candor given his recent appointment. Structured collaboration provides optimal arrangement for both parties while respecting the independent value each brings to client engagements. The conversation evolved into pragmatic discussion of how such collaboration might function, engagement parameters, resource coordination, commercial terms, and communication protocols. Throughout, Hammond and Pierce leadership demonstrated increasing recognition that relationship value existed in complementary capabilities rather than institutional control. By meeting's conclusion, we had established preliminary framework for strategic collaboration that would be formalized once my independent advisory practice had been properly established. Hammond and Pierce would maintain implementation support for Westfield's transformation while exploring potential collaboration on future engagements where our complementary capabilities might provide client value. As I left Hammond and Pierce offices that afternoon, the second time in 5 days I had departed the building under dramatically changed circumstances, I reflected on the extraordinary professional transformation that had occurred since Tuesday's dismissal meeting. What had begun as organizational rejection had catalyzed complete recalibration of my professional identity, from institutional component to independent strategist, applying expertise across multiple contexts through integrated relationship structure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.